There's much to discuss. Let's get to our panel. From London, Joe Twyman is the founder and director of Deltapoll, a public opinion research firm. In our studio, David Smith is the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for The Guardian. Joining us from Miami, Remi Piet is a research fellow at the University of Miami. And from Washington, D.C., Claude Barfield is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to all of you. David, let's start in the studio. So the negotiations over Britain's departure from the EU has reached a very crucial phase. We're hearing now of a no-deal Brexit, a soft Brexit, a hard Brexit, all these terms. But what's the key issue?
Probably trade, I would have to say, and also just sheer political deadlock in Westminster. We now have the Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, saying there's a 60-40 chance of no deal at all, and he represents quite a hard line in the Conservative Party, which we also see with Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg and others who seem prepared, frankly, to drive the country over the edge of a cliff. So you have this real political stalemate where Theresa May's Chequers proposal, it goes too far for some, not far enough for others. The British political establishment really can't find agreement on this, and that particular proposal has also been picked apart by the European Union. And I think, you know, trade and particularly the customs union is at the heart of those disagreements. Among the many complications for the UK, of course, is Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and that border. So really we seem to be in a deadlock, and now people are coming up with very radical solutions, such as, you know, another referendum, or at least a referendum that chooses between a hard or a soft Brexit, or a new prime minister, or a general election. And the fact we're even talking in those terms just shows you how difficult this has become.
Right. So the Chequers deal that you talk about, that's some kind of a compromise deal that the prime minister has put together. And there are people within her own party who don't accept that. They want a complete break.
Yeah, this was a few weeks ago, just before Donald Trump's visit, actually. Chequers, Theresa May drew up this proposal that, was probably more favourable to the soft Brexit camp, if you like, in that it preserved relations with the customs union, would have overcome most of that Irish problem. But very quickly it unravelled, and the more hardline Brexiters who want to really clean break with Europe came out one after another. We saw David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, resign, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, go, and so many others have really come out that it's dead on arrival and is frankly not going to fly. The European Union also had objections, and with that proposal dead, it does leave a question: where does she turn next, and where does the country turn next?
All right, let's go to Claude Barfield. Claude, we heard there in our report that a no-deal Brexit, some believe, could be economic disaster for Britain. Explain that to us. Would it be an economic disaster?
Well, I think the British would certainly have a great deal of difficulty. I'm going to defer to the others about the politics and the economics of the Brexit itself, and basically talk about my interest is in the proposed US-UK free trade agreement. And without making a judgment one way or the other about the hard versus soft, I would say that in terms of the possibilities of getting an agreement through, a soft agreement, which means that the Brits are going along with a number of European regulations, would make it much more difficult here, I think, to get the free trade agreement through. It's certainly true that the Trump administration, I think, will very much wants this agreement, because they have very little to show for their declared intentions of having a series of bilateral agreements. But the thing to keep in mind, if you're not in the United States, is that when Trump says he wants something, it's not just in his hands, not only in this, but in other foreign policy and economic measures. The Congress is really the final say here. And the degree to which the British government accedes to such European regulations about genetically modified organisms or trademarks or other regulatory issues is the degree that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to get a US-UK agreement through Congress. Though I suspect a number of people in Congress would like to have a US-UK free trade agreement.
Remi, as David Smith told us a moment ago, it looks like it's heading, according to a British minister, heading in the direction of a no-deal Brexit. That British Minister for International Trade, Liam Fox, said that a no-deal Brexit is growing because of what he called European Union intransigence. Is the EU playing hardball with Britain here?
I mean, they are playing hardball, and they're right to play hardball. I mean, the question here is that you can't divorce halfway with the European Union. You can't decide on the terms of your divorce. If you want to leave the European Union, then you have to do so. That's your right. But you can't try to have disintegration of the single act where you would have a limitation of trade in goods and services and non-immigration. I mean, basically what England wants was to maintain the status quo for imports and exports of goods and actually move back in terms of integration for financial services and immigration. You can't choose it this way. Same thing, you can't decide that part of your territory can actually be still somewhat part of the European Union. That's the case of Northern Ireland, to try to prevent some security issues in Ireland. It just doesn't play this way. And so what Theresa May is trying to do is convince not only Barnier, who's indeed intransigent, but that's his role, that's his mandate as the representative of the European Union, and also try to find some kind of common bridges with other head of states. She went to see President Macron in Fort de Brégançon during the weekend, but that was actually unsuccessful. As a result, you see the impact on the British economy is going to be dreadful. The pound has actually seen the lowest point in more than a year after the increased risk for hard Brexit, and the consequences for the British economy with increased costs of imports, harder possibilities of having inputs for the industry, a major layoff in the coming months and years, if this is the way that we're going, are going to be stunning for the British population.
Joe Twyman, what do you make of Remi's point there that the EU is playing hardball, and in a sense they have a right to play hardball? If Britain wants a divorce, it can have the divorce, but it can't take all the silver with it.
Well, he's absolutely right. We know that across the European Union countries there are, to varying degrees, pockets of anti-EU feeling. And the last thing that the European Union would want is to make this look easy and straightforward. And certainly they wouldn't want it to look beneficial for the country leaving. But it's worth pointing out that it's in nobody's interests to make these negotiations look straightforward. Everyone involved, whether it's the EU, whether it's different sections of the Conservative Party, whether it's the British political class in general, they don't want it to look easy. They want to be seen to be fighting for Britain or for the European Union at every single stage, so that plays well with their supporters back home. Because this is a negotiation and it's a hugely important one, but also it's a political issue, and nobody wants to be seen to be rolling over easily or in a straightforward manner, because that could damage them domestically at the ballot box.
I was going to say that as an American observer, one of the things that is striking to me, and Liam Fox was here at my institute last summer, is the sort of the delusions on all sides. I count Fox as a very savvy, he came across a very smart, intelligent, and quite well-informed trade minister. But he basically made the point, which goes back to something that someone just said about everybody's got to fight for it to make it seem like it's hard. He made the point here, and I think he had done so in other places, this is going to be really one of the easiest trade negotiations in the history of trade negotiations, both the British and EU and then the US-UK. And I remember challenging him at the time, what are you going to do about the fact that the European negotiators are going to demand that you bow to European law and regulations to some things? And he didn't seem to think that that was going to be a problem. What is now emerging is that it's going to be an insolvable problem.
Yeah, Liam Fox has significantly backtracked on that position, and indeed the opponents of Brexit are now pointing to his changing position as an example of the fact that the government in general, but also Theresa May's cabinet in particular, really doesn't have a well-formed idea. And of course, it's really key to remember here that the Conservative Party and the cabinet cannot agree themselves about how they wish to proceed. And so they then have to take, once and indeed if an agreement is reached internally between them, they then have to go to Europe. It's very much presented in this country as, oh, well, we just need to decide between ourselves and then Europe will almost agree to this magically. But of course, anyone who's paying attention knows that that is arguably the very best that we could hope for. And inevitably there will be further negotiations and further compromises. And while all of this is taking place, the clock is ticking. March next year is by no means a long time away, and yet very little progress has been made on these key issues, whether it be Northern Ireland, trade, immigration, all of which are important to greater or lesser degrees for the population.
Joe, on that point of time, as you point out, the clock is ticking. Do you think there will be a deal that will be acceptable to both sides, or could this drag on for years?
Well, it depends what I mean by both sides. If you're talking about sides within the cabinet, I think a deal that can be found that the cabinet supports is possible, not guaranteed, but certainly possible. Then the two sides, London and Britain versus the EU, whether a decision can be made that both sides support there. Again, possibly. I think it's less likely, but it's by no means outside the realms of possibility. But then can a deal be struck that both sides in Britain then support, the Remainers and the Leavers? I think that's extraordinarily unlikely. And the implications, therefore, for Theresa May as Prime Minister, and indeed the Conservative Party as the party of government, are enormous. And everyone involved with this process in Britain knows that. The last thing they want to do is endanger the entire government simply to push through a particular position.
David, at the time of the referendum in 2016, your newspaper, The Guardian, published the results of an analysis that was done by Google on what was the issue that was driving this, and they found that immigration was the issue. That was the key issue, and it played a big role in the Leave campaign. Why did immigration play such a big role?
I think for similar reasons that we've seen around the rest of Europe and indeed the world, that a lot of this is the politics of fear, and people who felt they were struggling economically were encouraged, in some cases I'm afraid, by the Leave campaign to scapegoat immigrants, and it came after, about a decade after the financial crisis of the pressures of that, but it also came in the wake of the Arab Spring and the refugees we'd seen going from Libya and Syria to Europe, and played into some very long-standing sentiments among some people in the UK about being an island nation and some old prejudices. But I think among the Leave campaign there was sometimes dishonesty. There was sometimes caricaturing these positions and playing up to that. There were other factors as well, but what you often saw, as you do sometimes in the US with Donald Trump's rhetoric and building the wall, that some of the strongest anti-immigrant sentiment was actually in places with very few immigrants, whereas a city like London, which is tremendously diverse and international, and has people from all over the world, was actually sort of firmly against Brexit.
But there was one difference in Britain, wasn't there? I mean, there was some sentiment against people in Europe, from the European Union, who were entitled to come and work in Britain from other countries, East European countries, for instance.
Yes, especially there was certainly, you'd hear some of the rhetoric talking about, sort of Polish builders and Polish plumbers and this kind of thing, and certainly an appeal that British people wanted jobs back for themselves, and a lot of those tropes that we've heard before. And in terms of what we've just been listening to, in terms of the political divisions on this within the UK, a lot of this was relevant not only to the Conservative Party, which is hopelessly divided, but the opposition Labour Party as well, where some of this anti-immigrant sentiment and strong pro-Brexit feeling was actually in Labour Party strongholds. Right. And the Labour leader himself, Jeremy Corbyn, has long had suspicion of the European Union, so that further complicates the entire political environment in Britain, that at the last general election there was not a clear choice to say vote one way for Brexit or vote another to remain in the EU. In fact, both parties have deep fissures on this, and whether you're for or against immigration is a big part of that story.
As an outside observer, what difference would it make if, by whatever circumstances, you had a Labour government come into power? What difference would it make in terms of Brexit and the negotiations?
Well, that is a great question. I mean, nobody really knows for sure. I certainly don't, and Labour has been able to hide to an extent because this is the Conservatives' mess and they have to get on with it. I think within, Jeremy Corbyn apart, within the ranks of Labour, there are probably a lot more anti-Brexit politicians there, but it's one of the great sort of what-if questions if Jeremy Corbyn suddenly found himself with this mess.
Joe, go ahead.
Well, just to answer that question, Labour, in terms of its MPs, in terms of its politicians, is less divided than the Conservative are. They tend, as was said, to lean more towards a sort of softer Brexit or indeed remaining part of the EU. But among their supporters, they're more divided than the Conservatives, and so that makes for an interesting question about how would it play out with the Labour government, and we don't really know. But just to go back to the issue of immigration that was mentioned, a lot of attention was paid during the campaign. Indeed has been paid since to the economic impact of immigration and the importance that played during the whole discussions before and after the referendum. But it's worth pointing out that there's a whole lot of data out there that shows it's not just about economics for people when it comes to the issue of immigration. People believe that the country and indeed their areas have changed in a way that they are sometimes not comfortable with, and crucially, sometimes feel they did not consent to. And yes, that can be in economic terms. They haven't seen their wages increase, or they feel job insecurity and things like that. But it can also be important in terms of cultural terms, in social terms, in political terms, and even indeed in religious terms. People believe that some people believe that Britain is no longer a Christian country, for instance. And so, although a lot of attention has been paid to the economic argument, there's a whole another area that isn't explored in as much detail and has to be addressed if Brexit is going to be perceived as being a success.
I agree. I agree. Yeah.
Remi, I mean, we've been looking at the effects this is going to be having on Britain, but what's at stake for the European Union? I mean, here we have the European Union. This was the great European dream, a united Europe, this grand alliance. I mean, does the fact that Britain is going to withdraw from the EU actually test and affect the EU's political credibility?
Well, that's actually why it's so important to have those negotiations around the Brexit that lead to a positive outcome for the European Union construction on the perspective of the Europeans. I mean, if I want to transition to the conversation that we were having about the fear, irrational fear on immigration, but also the disappearance of a certain way of life in Great Britain, this is a traditional feeling of facing globalization and actually be afraid of globalization. In a sense, the building of the European Union was a way to protect Europe against other, former maybe stronger immigration from outside. I mean, trying to build a common circle, a common ground for European countries, and where sovereignty would be pooled indeed, but you would have some kind of a model of integration and model of society among European countries. Now, by having, looking at Great Britain moving away from it, I'm not sure it's going to be able to protect more its own identity, its own model of society outside of the European Union. In terms of jobs, for example, job creation, maybe you're going to be having like a lot less loss of job by having less immigration from Eastern European countries. And even on this, there's been a series of compromise stricken with the European Union on this. But you will lose much more jobs by having those companies from the city moving away to Frankfurt or Paris, or having a increase of the cost of inputs for industries that will, cost a lot of jobs for the British economy. So you're actually losing much more on the other hand that you would win by trying to protect your own border. That's the last cause of protectionism in a globalized world. From the perspective of the European Union, well, the question is how much were you able to, or were you willing to compromise to the UK? For the last 30 years, the European Union has allowed to have a reduced contribution to the European budget, the famous Thatcher check that was negotiated by Margaret Thatcher. Then there was the possibility of the UK to not be within the Eurozone and trying not to be inside other series of different agreements of the European Union. At some point, you have to say stop, and you have to show that the integration within the European Union is to be part of a common model, and a model that might be represented by Macron, by Merkel, and by other countries from Eastern Europe if they're able to voice their own interest in building together a common institutional scheme.
David, this discussion is throwing up all kinds of scenarios, not just in Britain, but around the world as well. And one of those scenarios is a second referendum, as you pointed out. There's a former English footballer, Gary Lineker, who's among those favouring a second referendum. But one supporter of Brexit countered that by saying, Yes, I'd like to see a rerun of the FA Cup final as well, again and again until Manchester United win. What are the chances of a second referendum?
And that is the problem, that kids love to say, oh, best out of three. Yes. And you know, I myself, I'm very much opposed to Brexit. I think it was a crazy idea, and I wish it never happened. But even I have trouble with the idea of, oh, we lost, therefore we should be allowed to have a rerun. And I think, you know, many people balk at that suggestion, even though, you know, one hears arguments about, well, the Russians interfered or this was cheated and so on. So I think a second referendum on the decision is probably unlikely, and Theresa May has certainly ruled it out. I suspect other Conservative potential successors would as well. There is other talk of, well, why don't we have a new referendum perhaps on what type of Brexit we want to do, hard Brexit or soft Brexit or no deal at all, and have a sort of three-sided campaign on that. And that's another interesting suggestion. But I think, you know, the problem with this from the start has been this is an incredibly technical issue. During the referendum, many of the arguments were not properly explored and appreciated. Can we really assume that in another referendum that we'd get a proper detailed hearing on both sides? You know, we have elected representatives for a reason. And frankly, they did create this mess by holding a referendum in the first place, and now they should probably get us out of it.
Joe Twyman, looking at this idea of another referendum or the referendum itself, who will approve a final deal when one is reached? Will it be just the British government? Will it be the British Parliament? Or could we even see a referendum on a new deal?
Well, it's very difficult to know precisely what will happen once we get there. As things stand at the moment, Parliament has to have a say, and so it's not the kind of thing that the Prime Minister can just arbitrarily declare. For a second referendum, that would take legislation, and indeed that would need an act of Parliament in order for that to take place. I think it's unlikely, but by no means completely outside the realms of possibility that that could happen. Support for a second referendum is growing if you look at things in terms of a second referendum once negotiations have completed. You know, if you ask people, should a second referendum take place now, only about 1 in 5 people says that it should, with around about a third in total saying it should either be a second referendum or we just should abandon the whole process and not leave at all. When it comes to a second referendum once the negotiations are completed, then you do see a slight, and I do stress slight, plurality of British voters supporting that idea, and that, although that number has grown, it's by no means overwhelming. Overall, however, around about 7 in 10 people believes that Brexit should take place, either because they supported it first time around or because they believe that democracy should be upheld and the results should be respected. But of course, their form of Brexit, when respondents answer that, varies wildly, and the Prime Minister may find that while 70% of people support Brexit in principle, when it comes to the conclusion of the negotiations, only 5, 10, perhaps only 3% of people actually support the final outcome. In which case, and this is again not completely outside of the realms of possibility, the government may find that a second referendum is politically expedient in order to save themselves at the ballot box domestically. But these are all a lot of unknowns, a lot of hypotheticals, and so it's not possible to say.
Remi, just on that point of a second referendum, do you think the European Union would be open to that, to looking at the results of a new referendum?
Well, it's not the European Union's decision. I mean, if one of the countries wants to upheld some kind of election, whether it's a referendum or any election, the European Union has no say into it. I think that the way that we'll have to look at it is, what does the United Kingdom want to have, and what is their position on the global exchequer? They want to be a closer partner to the United States. Now, if you're looking at the conversation that had just happened between Juncker and Donald Trump, we're seeing as potentially as a larger trade agreement already between the European Union and the US. So what will be the position of the UK towards this? So the question is not so much in terms of a referendum. If there's going to be a referendum to try to rejoin the European Union, every single country has the right to ask for acceptation with that European Union. There's a series of conditions to follow that the United Kingdom is fully aware of.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.